I don't think that I have to tell any of you how happy I am to be here. Although I sat over there and ate like a pig, uh, I hope that it's obvious how excited I am to be here. In a way, back home. Now, if I began to delineate all of the people here and my history with New Bedford, I would run out of the 2 minutes they told me I had to speak. So as a journalist who worked in television, I'm going to look at the clock and try to meet the deadline. She's telling me again, 2 minutes. So it's 7:08. Raise your hand when you want me to shut up. Now, you may have heard an introduction that I'm very proud of. Thank you. But you see, at 81 years old, I have attached another ID to myself, and that is woke. Okay, don't applaud too long, because I only have, you're going to give me the sign. But in that ID of being woke, I often on occasions like this turn to the words of the woke brother, some of you will know, LL Cool J. Some of you did know, okay? Don't call it a new J, LL Cool J says. I've been here for years. And on occasion these days, where there are a lot of new things out there, I come with the hope developed from my history. And it is because of that, I come with a history of practicing the kind of journalism you just heard about. My goodness, congratulations to you. Oh, really. And it's happening everywhere. So get the money from these people and travel to a few other places where it's happening. But I'm here because of my history. Practicing the kind of journalism you just heard the New Bedford Light does, shining a light on the community in which it lives. Providing news that is real to them. Real, regardless of race, creed, color, or gender. Now, I do want to share with you how I got to this point, because it speaks to my appreciation of the New Bedford Light. This is history, but it's also my history. So in my earliest years, I got my inspiration from a reporter who traveled the world in search of stories. And I see somebody smiling, so you know who I'm talking about. That was Brenda Starr. But in time, don't laugh, you'll take up my time. But in time, in my all-black, segregated school, I got something that I needed. Something that brought me here, I think, today. And although Ida B. Wells may not have been your inspiration, you are living out the dream of Ida B. Wells. Because Ida B. Wells, and I quote, had an instinctive feeling that the people who had little or no school training should have something coming into their homes weekly which dealt with their problems in a simple way and a helpful way. It was a time of challenge to people of color and those who supported them, because they were not all black And that's one of the problems I have today. I hate generalizations. I hate it when people talk about white people. I hate it when they talk about black people, because that's too much of a generalization. Look at what you're doing. And I don't know how many of you or what color, but it doesn't matter. You're doing the right thing. And so when people generalize about black people and white people, or especially about white people, I have to tell them about the white people who died for us. Yesterday, was it yesterday? They gave John Lewis a stamp. John Lewis, who almost died for us. I don't know how I had any sense when he finally got to Congress, because they had beat the living you-know-what out of his head. But it was in Atlanta, Georgia, that I had my first opportunity to follow in the footsteps of Ida B. Wells, working with Julian Bond, who was a leader in the civil rights movement, and my dear friend, and M. Carl Holman, who was a professor at Clark, English professor at Clark College. And they created an upstart newspaper called the Atlanta Inquirer. It was started because, and I'm going to generalize in this instance because it's the case, a white newspaper rarely covered in detail the activities of the Atlanta student movement. But neither did the black paper. Because the black paper, the oldest black paper in the country, advertisers were mostly white. So they couldn't do what needed to be done out of fear of offending their white supporters. But these young people who worked with me, well, I'm running ahead of myself, but they were not dependent on any white advertisers. So they could get out and cover whatever was going on with these young people in Atlanta, trying to bring about, I guess you would say, adherence to the 1954 decision. Now, I mentioned the 1954 decision in a school the other day, and not the teacher, not the principal, nobody knew what the 54 decision meant. Now, they may now know a little bit because it's starting to be a little bit in the news. But if I could indulge you for a few minutes, as I briefly go back over my 60 years, I wanted to work on the student newspaper at the University of Georgia. Now, you heard that I integrated the University of Georgia? No, sorry about that. I desegregated it. There's a difference. Which is one of the things that we need to be very careful in our writing, that we are accurate in terms of how we describe things. But anyway, I go there, and I wanted to be a journalist. That was the whole case. So I go to the Red and Black, which is a student newspaper, and wait for assignments. But Athens, Georgia was still segregated, and the white students at the newspaper didn't want to work with me. And so Tom Johnson, who was the editor and later became head of CNN, was all for me, but there was a little that he could do. So what happened was, in time, I would drive the 70 miles from Athens, Georgia to Atlanta, drop my suitcase, and go over to Carl Holman's basement, where he and Julian were recording what was going on with the Atlanta student movement. They would get arrested, that was the point, so that they could make cases that challenged the lack of compliance with the 54 decision. And so I would work, the students would get arrested, then they would get bailed out, and they would come to Carl's basement and tell their story, and I would write it up. But in time, I got sick of being in the basement. And so I said, I got to get in the street. And so I went to one of the first things I covered there was the all-black school, Howard High School, David T. Howard, some of you will have know him from history. But it was overcrowded. But in order to get classes, they had to pass an all-white school that was virtually empty to get to a bunch of, I don't see any out there, but they were shacks that had been set up for these black kids. And that was the time that I realized how much power I had. I didn't know up to that point, but I called and asked to speak to the superintendent of schools. This is Charlayne Hunter from the Atlanta Inquirer. She came to the phone. I said, oh my God, I gotta get real here. And I asked her questions, she answered them, and I did the story. And working with Carl and Julian, now Julian was also head of the Atlanta student movement, but there were times that what they were doing was so important that I had to write it and it appeared in the paper. But there were also times after a day of demonstrating and getting arrested, they would convene like you convene here today at somebody's house, and they would party down. They had been demonstrating, gone to jail, or, released from jail, and were now enjoying the rest of the day. So Julian Bond, as I said, who was a leader of the student movement, when they were partying down, he eventually wrote a poem about it. And it goes like this: see that girl, shake that thing, we can't all be Martin Luther King. I also had the privilege of meeting Martin Luther King one day when I was covering the highly successful, actually, black businesses in town. And one of the things that he didn't have much to say to me, but when I rushed up to him and said, Dr. King, and before I could get out my name, he said, I know who you are, and we're proud of what you're doing down there. Well, I almost fainted. Now, what keeps me going? Anyway, everyone in this room knows well, as you heard, that our profession is now facing new challenges. You looking at me? From downsizing and cutbacks, a development by way that's hitting minorities the hardest. But we are on the brink of a country that will soon see people of color in the majority. So I'm old enough to remember at the conclusion of the Kerner Commission report, it blamed the media, in fact, saying that America was caught by surprise during the riots back in those days in the mid-60s, primarily because the media didn't have anyone from those neighborhoods reporting what was going on that led to what was happening before it boiled over. So I'm just saying, hey. And then there's the new fast-moving, head-spinning world of social media, which has a role to play, but needs to do it responsibly. And while I didn't understudy the South African clairvoyance known as Sangomas during the 17 years Ron, my husband, and I lived in South Africa, I feel fairly confident in predicting that the sine qua non in a journalistic arsenal will remain the 4 W's and an H, and sometimes, if the journalist had been on a beat long enough, maybe a Y. Nobody knows that better than journalists who live among and report, dare I say, on their people. It is reporting that led to my latest book, My People. It's a collection of 60 years of reporting, much of it from neighborhoods like this, and people in their full humanity, including people who came from Cape Verde. Yes. And they found the inkwell on Martha's Vineyard. they found Oak Bluffs a welcoming place. And then there were those who identified as LGBTQ. To be sure, those were some turbulent times. But when I listened to some of the songs from back in the day, like, What's Going On? Y'all know who sang that? Mother, 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 there's far too many of you crying. But then they've got another line in that song. We've got to find a way to bring some loving here today. Now, I didn't do it as good as he did it, but you know the words. So here's LL Cool J. I'm woke. LL Cool J. Stop off here, LL Cool J, with me here in New Bedford. For we have our challenges, and you have had your challenges, but you continue to overcome time and time again. Our history, which is on the, I'm not going to let it be on the chopping block, although there are people who want it on the chopping block, but that ain't going to happen, okay? And don't quote me because I don't usually mess up the English language like that. But anyway, I want LL Cool J to stop off with me here in New Bedford. For we and you have had our challenges, but you have overcome time and again. Our history shows us that despite challenges, we can overcome. And our local journalism is critical to that. I think you know that. Wait, you're taking up my time. As my late colleague Jim Lehrer used to say, give people good information and they will do the right thing. And that's still relevant today, as are the words of another great journalist in a different context. It was he who said, this instrument can teach, it can illuminate, it can inspire, but it can only do so to the extent that human beings are willing to use it to those ends. Otherwise, it's merely lights and wires in a box. Hello, New Bedford Light. You got that? And so, in conclusion, let me say, your work, and I've been so thrilled to meet so many of you this evening, your work is some of what inspires me to keep on keeping on. For as Jeff Tubin once said, he learned from his mother, the pioneering journalist Marlene Sanders, and if you don't know about her, look her up. He said that his mother, he didn't say this, but it was in effect that engagement in the world inhibits aging. Okay. I gotta finish now. She's looking at me. But I also remain inspired by a Nigerian cab driver who picked me up on a New York street a few years ago before I got to be 81, but it wasn't that much longer. And he heard me say where I wanted to go. And then he suddenly turned around and looked at me. He said, NPR, right? And I said, yeah, that's right. And then he said, well, it's great seeing someone your age still out there. So now that was before I got to be 81, right? So I want to thank you, each one of you who are part of this organization and who are supporting it. And I'm told you are really doing a great job supporting it. I want to have you thankfully for helping me still be out there at 81. And I want to thank you for being out there and keeping it real for your people. Thank you.